I'm Blake Newman.
I'm Brie Ripley.
And this is the Agile Podcast, where we explore the stories and people behind Agile web solutions. Last episode, we talked about Drupal 7 Doomsday.
Which is the day when hundreds of thousands of websites powered by Drupal 7 will suddenly become abandoned by their makers. But in all seriousness, Drupal 7 end of life will affect over 250,000 websites around the world, which sounds apocalyptic.
Well, it's bad, but it's not as bad as it sounds if you plan ahead and get started on moving out of Drupal 7 now. And Brie, you run a major health organization's digital presence. And since we're constantly talking Agile, and because one of the key components that we talk about with Agile is having priorities.
Right. Agile means not just responding to things. It's thinking about long-term goals and not worrying about the small things that pop up along the way.
Exactly. And I want to ask you, what are your priorities in the content management system? What do you want your CMS to do?
I want it to insert a microchip in my brain so it can read all of my thoughts and I never have to really do anything with my hands. Again, I can just tap somebody else's head that I have to train with my head. Maybe that's too much boundary.
Siri.
I know. I just want to be able to teach people quickly, easily how to use an interface. I'm constantly training interns and getting up to speed myself on different CMSs. So what I want really is a simplified interface with options to add text, insert photos, embed videos, and maybe show off a flashy GIF every now and again.
So just keep those in mind. Today, we're starting to talk about the alternatives to Drupal 7, and where you go has a lot to do with your priorities. We know that D7 is going away, and organizations running D7 need to make a change. So we'll look at how to accomplish your goals through a migration. So just to recap, Drupal is a CMS.
Or content management system, which is good for sending out info, whether it's a blog or a more complicated site that displays a lot of data.
And tons of government agencies, nonprofit organizations, and member associations and universities use Drupal. There are 15 federal departments in the United States. 11 of those departments have websites powered by Drupal.
And last episode, we talked about why. Go listen to it if you want to learn more. But basically, Drupal is relatively easy to stand up. But there's a lot of sophistication in the custom modules, which are created by Drupal's open source community.
And there's also custom code, which is the functionality built specifically for your website.
All to say, Drupal is a very powerful CMS.
But last week, we also talked about how Drupal 7 is reaching its end of life.
And there are around 300,000 websites still using Drupal 7 as we record this episode.
And there's some really big sites using D7, like nasa.gov.
Wow.
In fact, of the 11 departments in the federal government running Drupal, 6 of them are powered by D7, including Department of Justice, Interior, Health and Human Services, Housing and Urban Development, Energy, Education, and the Department of Homeland Security.
Whoa, and they're all going to have to move, all of them.
Right, and soon. People responsible for these websites will need to make some decisions, and they've got 5 basic options. One is to stay in the Drupal family. Make the move to a new Drupal version, like D9, D10. 2 is to move to a Drupal cousin, like Backdrop CMS. 3 is to switch to the dark side and migrate to Drupal's archenemy, WordPress.
Archenemy?
Yes, archenemy. Drupal and WordPress both came out around the same time, early 2000s. Drupal started out as an online bulletin board system, a BBS, like AOL. WordPress came out as a blog platform, like Blogger, which was acquired by Google. They didn't start out as competitors, but as time went on, they've been jockeying for position.
Ah, like Pepsi and Coke.
Yeah, or like Burger King and McDonald's.
Like Boeing and Airbus.
Right, just like that. But enough about that. The fourth option is to get out of a CMS completely and go to somewhere like Symfony or Python or Django. And your fifth option is to freeze your site in a time capsule. Get a dedicated server, make your site read-only, move into a cave, be in Drupal 7 forever.
And read-only, just so we're clear, that means you won't be able to change anything on your site.
Right, that's why I said read-only. So this episode is going to focus exclusively on option 1, staying in Drupal.
And if you stay in Drupal, there is one big change you have to know about, and it has to do with Symfony.
So So the core engine of Drupal was originally built in PHP. But for Drupal 8 and all future versions of Drupal, the core has been built on top of another piece of software called Symfony, which is a PHP framework.
It's kind of like Legos.
Or a wedding cake.
No, Blake, we're just going to stick with Legos.
Okay, Legos.
So Symfony is a web application framework built with a bunch of PHP blocks. Drupal 8 used the Symfony framework to build the latest version of Drupal 8 and 9. They're just kind of stacking on top of each other.
That does sound like Legos. So there's these open source community volunteers responsible for PHP. Yet another open source community of volunteers who use PHP to build Symfony. And finally, another community of volunteers who use Symfony to build Drupal 8. Here's Shefali, project manager at Angelina.
This version is a major uplift. They have kind of changed a lot in Drupal. Basically, they have changed the entire architecture to make it more modern.
So in the past, major versions of Drupal were more alike than different. Think Romance languages. Imagine Drupal 5 being in French, Drupal 6 being in Spanish, Drupal 7 in Italian. Translating between D5 to D6 or D6 to D7 was not a major exercise. It's like people who speak Spanish can understand people who speak Italian.
But when they wrote Drupal 8, it was like going from English to Mandarin. Huge problems in translation, huge effort. None of the code can be easily translated or automatically translated. It's going to make migrating and staying in Drupal a bit more difficult than normal. But hopefully, once in Symfony, migrating will be much easier. Here's Shefali again.
Migration from a major version to another is really very time consuming and very intensive. So that is, I guess, is the biggest flaw of Drupal. They claim that wouldn't be the case from Drupal 8 to 9 onwards.
Because of Symfony. Though Shefali still has her concerns.
But I would like to reserve my comments until I see it in action.
I love Shefali.
Wow, not holding her breath, is she? Okay. So this is a whole new system. Earlier versions of Drupal had life expectancies of like 5-7 years. In fact, Drupal 7 was around for 10 years.
Wow. That coincides nicely with the life expectancy of an average website.
Right. But with Drupal 8, 9, and 10, the life cycles are shorter. They're in the 2 to 3 year range.
So organizations are going to need to start upgrading more frequently, not less.
Right. But the Drupal people keep saying that after Drupal 8, upgrading to future versions of Drupal would be seamless, mostly automated. They say it will make Drupal future-proof.
So, in theory, it'll be easier to migrate when the future versions of Drupal reach their end of life because they will be all based on the same framework, Symfony.
So they say, and those future versions are coming up soon. D8 goes away in 2021 because Symfony 3 is reaching its end of life that year. D9 goes away in 2023 when Symfony 4 retires. And then D10 will replace D9.
So, if you haven't moved out of D7 yet, and you're going to stay in Drupal, then you'll likely need to skip Drupal 8 altogether and go straight to Drupal 9.
And this all comes down to the Symfony framework. Here's Shefali again.
Symfony has its own upgrade track. So basically, Drupal 8's end of life, you would not be able to extend it.
The Drupal community has no control over that. They are completely dependent.
Yep, and D7 was supposed to reach end of life in 2021 as well. But the difference is that D7 is not dependent on Symfony. So the Drupal community was able to decide that D7 support could be extended. So it now reaches its end of life in 2022, a year after Drupal 8, which seems kind of odd. It's like outliving your children.
But D8 is not really an offspring of D7, Blake. It's more like a new species. It's like when humans replaced Neanderthals something like 50,000 years ago.
Well, it's not exactly like that, and it certainly wasn't 50,000 years ago.
Yeah.
Although to many people who've only known D7 for the past 10 years, this is a pretty radical change.
Drupal 8 was rebuilt from the ground up and is a completely different type of development architecture than D7. It was built in an object-oriented way. And object-oriented programming is a more modern way of developing code.
Right. Object-oriented programming, or OOP.
Oop!
So when we say we're migrating from D7 to D8 or D9, the only thing we're really migrating is the content, data, and maybe the users and user permissions. Everything else needs to be completely rebuilt. Here's John, a backend developer at Agilina.
Basically, it's completely different. So the way you render content and access the database and so on, everything is different. There were some kind of legacy things they tried to bring over to, I think, ease the transition for developers, but for the most part, it's completely different.
So what John's saying right here helps pose a really big question. Is this what you, as a site manager, really want?
Right. I reached out to Jeff Barris. He's the communications director of Pulitzer Center. His organization migrated out of Drupal 7, and he emailed me his response, which our producer, Hans, will read now.
Our site, which predated me by about a decade, was always a Drupal site. It makes heavy use of Drupal's taxonomies, and our best alternative, WordPress, would have required a significant level of effort to get the CMS to match our existing functionality. It seemed easier to keep the site in Drupal and migrate to Drupal 8. WordPress's best feature, Gutenberg, is available in Drupal 8. We did seriously consider WordPress, but Drupal seemed like the safer bet.
I was just going to say, I think that we're better readers than Hans. I don't know. Sorry.
So staying in Drupal might be great for you because it's what you've done before. You may have people already at your company who know Drupal.
And for many organizations running Drupal 7, which have invested a lot of time and money in training people how to use Drupal, and just maintaining a Drupal site itself, they may want to stick with the Drupal family. Let's meet Carlos, a senior developer at Agilina.
My name is Carlos Fernandez.
Carlos started as a WordPress developer. Then he learned Joomla while living in Mexico.
Fast forward 2-3 years ago, in my first job here in the US, I was doing a lot of front-end development. It was also a government contractor, so they had a lot of Drupal sites and not enough people to work on them.
So, of course, they asked Carlos to work on Drupal sites because he had a PHP background. He said yes. And today, well, I'll let Carlos tell it.
I'm basically in love with Drupal, and I see myself being a better Drupal developer and working on more projects.
So Carlos has worked with a lot of different content management systems. He obviously has a Drupal bias, but he has good reasoning. He loves the capabilities that Drupal has to offer, but that comes at a price.
You need to have a capable team of developers.
And Drupal is very powerful.
Comparing to WordPress, it's out of the box. You can install a theme and you can have a site up and running in a few hours. Drupal requires a bit more of configuration or some other setup to make it exactly what you need.
So it's really complex, and that could make maintaining your site more expensive. But it could also be great because you can get exactly what you want.
I got a chance to talk to Tim Lennon. He's the Chief Technology Officer at the Drupal Foundation. That's a nonprofit organization that supports Drupal's open source community. There's a perception that Drupal is for enterprise-level sites, big government agencies, or larger news organizations. But Tim prefers to say it's for ambitious experiences, which is also a term that Drupal's founder, Dries Buytaert, uses.
And he specifically uses that word rather than enterprise for, I think, a good reason. If we're talking about enterprise experiences, usually what we mean is sort of large corporate, big IT team, lots of data kind of scale. And sure, Drupal is great for those environments. But ambitious can also mean maybe a startup trying to do something innovative, like use Drupal as a content store for both an retail outlet on a normal web page and also kind of an augmented reality display inside a storefront.
Right. Not necessarily something big in terms of scale, but pretty dang ambitious.
And I tend to agree with him on this. There's a lot of content management systems you can go to that are cheaper and easier to use. But
when you're really thinking about being digitally present with what you're doing, you start to care about more sophisticated features, users and permissions, content relationships, different sorts of channels for displaying that content. And that's where Drupal comes into its own.
So the effort to stay in Drupal can very well be worth it.
Exactly. Now, another reason you might want to stay in Drupal is because of the architecture. Drupal has architectural components called taxonomies, content types, nodes. They classify everything into these different components. If you move out of Drupal, well, you have to translate everything, and you may have just spent a decade in the Drupal system. WordPress doesn't have taxonomies or content types per se. It's a bit simpler, a lot less complicated.
So it's a heavy lift to do in WordPress what you can do in Drupal.
Remember when we talked about going from D6 to D7, like translating from French to Italian? And going from D7 to D8 is like going from Italian to Chinese? Going to D7 to WordPress, it's like going from Italian to Dothraki, Game of Thrones, or Klingon from Star Trek.
Yeah, I never watched either of those, Blake.
Where have you been?
Busy with crayons for Star Trek and hanging out near the food at the GOT parties.
Okay. Well, anyway, if you'd watched those movies and if you'd stayed in the Drupal family products, you wouldn't have to deal with all that.
That is why Carlos loves where Drupal is going with Symfony.
I'm excited about Drupal 8 and Drupal 9.
But not every developer is excited about the changes to Drupal. You can find some Reddit posts saying goodbye to Drupal after the move to D8 and the new Symfony framework. There's some pretty angry tweets out there.
No, for sure, but that happens when literally anything in this world changes.
Yeah, internet trolls. But still, many organizations and people are abandoning Drupal altogether. There will be probably fewer D8 sites than D7, probably fewer D9 sites than D8. According to Google, Drupal's been on a downward trend since its peak around 2010.
Here's John again.
One of the reasons why we've seen the lower adoption rate from Drupal 7 and Drupal 8 is there was kind of a shift in the community where a lot of people didn't like the idea of having to relearn a framework essentially from scratch.
Having said that, many organizations running D7 believe it's easier and less difficult to migrate from D7 to D8 or D9 than to leave Drupal altogether.
Yeah, but is it? Is it easier?
Well, probably is, but here's the question you need to ask. Is staying in Drupal really going to meet your goals? Drupal has got a lot of strengths. There's the Drupal community, which tends to be very technical, more security-oriented, and also a little bit more, perhaps, altruistic. For example, Drupal has a very rich selection of those contributed modules we talked about in the last episode. They're built by the community, and they're free. Here's John.
Vendors are actually not allowed, part of the open source license agreement, they're not allowed to actually charge for Drupal itself.
The WordPress community? Well, they tend to be a bit different. Perhaps more enterprising might be the word.
Yeah, enterprising, entrepreneurial. Yeah, so, where Drupal has modules, WordPress has plugins.
And many vendors have created premium plugins, which come at a cost. So WordPress is free, but you have to pay a lot for the add-ons. It's not a bad business model, but it's just a different mindset than Drupal.
And the plugins from WordPress are not fully vetted by the community, which means there could be a lot more security vulnerabilities and maybe even spyware built within them. In fact, most of the security vulnerabilities of WordPress, they likely come in the form of plugins.
Interesting. Compares to Drupal, where they tend to be a lot more secure. Contributed modules tend to be more thoroughly vetted by more tech-savvy developers.
And you can create a matrix where some users have some permissions in some parts of the website, but not in others.
For example, say you want HR people at your organization to author posts in the career section, but nowhere else on your website. You can do that naturally with Drupal. It is inherently more secure. And since future versions of Drupal will all be built on the same Symfony platform, future migrations should be mostly automated.
So they say. Carlos says there's a lot of advantages to staying in Drupal.
As a tool, it grew in a lot of ways. It has become more powerful and more easy to use, not only for the backend developer, but also for the regular user, the web manager or the content manager.
Oh, yeah, that sounds pretty good for this content manager.
Right, but critics of the new Drupal core say that it's processor intensive, which makes it run slow and consumes a lot of server resources. Some developers were so unhappy with the direction of Drupal 8 and 9 that they abandoned it altogether and formed a new community, Backdrop CMS.
Oh yeah, that's just a version of Drupal 7 that people can stay in.
Right, they forked the code. We'll talk about that next week. Yeah, fork in the code. How do you do that? Stick a fork in it. I think I'm done. But another big factor is cost. While the code in Drupal is essentially free, hiring people to manage your site isn't. Many government websites powered by Drupal require a team of developers just to maintain, which could cost well over $1 million per year. Plus, we have no guarantee that the new migrations out of Drupal will be easy. So there's a lot to consider when choosing whether to stay in Drupal or move on. Or, as Carlos says,
every project is different, every client is different. I mean, the fact that Drupal is super flexible doesn't mean that WordPress cannot do the job.
Okay, so how do you pick a CMS?
Well, it goes back to Agile and setting your priorities. It might be that you already have Drupal developers working for you. You might like certain features in Drupal. But you also might see this as a chance to get away from Drupal because it was never a good fit in the first place. To be honest, sometimes a Drupal developer is kind of like a person walking around with a hammer who views every problem as a nail. You need a blog? I got Drupal. Need an app? I got Drupal. Need your light bulb changed? I got Drupal. Exactly. All problems can be solved with Drupal. And it's true, you could build a lot of different things in Drupal. But what's best for you, the person who has to live with the CMS for the foreseeable future? And Brie, what were the priorities in the CMS again?
Besides a microchip straight into my brain, I would say simplified options to add text, photos, embed video, and add some GIFs.
Well, in that case, sounds like WordPress could totally suit your needs. Drupal could be overkill, but we also have to take a look at the larger organization itself and understand the needs of other stakeholders. Could be that there's some more complex functionality and requirements that would really justify Drupal.
So I can see there are some pluses with staying in Drupal. It's great for complex integrations, has an open source community that can help out, and it should be easier to migrate to new versions, and it's just plain powerful. But it also might be too complex if you're a small organization with a small budget. You need to hire people who know Drupal, and you won't really get the functionality you need from this CMS if you're just setting it up out of the box. That may not be the road you want to go down.
That's a lot to consider, and everyone's needs are different. And next week, we'll talk about a different road to go down, a fork of Drupal's code.
We'll talk about whatever that means on the next episode, so smash the subscribe button on the Agile Podcast, on Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
And please leave a review while you're at it. Thanks for listening. Until next time.
So long. Talk to you soon.
The Agile Podcast is produced by Agilina, a DC-based web development company. To learn more about Agilina, you can visit our website, agilina.com, or send us an email to results@agilina.com. That's AGILEANA.com.
So you think you're a better reader than me, huh? Is that what I'm hearing from everyone?